Okie doke. Thanks, a few more people joining. All right, great. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Nature Conservancy's Nature Uninterrupted webinar series. Typically this time of year, we love getting outside with all of you during our field trips, but unfortunately we are all much closer to home these days, although it seems like, you know, some of those guidelines are relaxing a bit. But we're really excited to have you spend some time with us today on this virtual field trip, paddling the wetlands, Otter Creek swamps specifically. For those of you that don't know, the Nature Conservancy is a global organization. We do work in all 50 states, and the Vermont chapter of the Nature Conservancy has been, this is our 60th year. And we welcome all of you to continue joining into our webinar series and potential events maybe in the fall as we navigate the pandemic situation. But that being said, I'd like to introduce to you our presenters today. Lynn McNamara is our Director of Stewardship. We own 58 natural areas across Vermont, totaling roughly 30,000 acres. And it is Lynn's job with her small but mighty team to manage all of those natural areas that are open to the public for fishing, hiking, hunting. Not all of them are open right now, although the majority are. We welcome people to visit those and follow the safety guidelines. We're also joined today by Jim Andrews, who's a herpetologist and wildlife biologist who works closely with state, federal, NGOs, and individuals on herpetole conservation throughout Vermont. We really appreciate him joining us today. He was telling me before we kicked off the webinar how he used to help us lead field trips decades ago. So thanks for joining us on this virtual field trip. And I will leave it now to Lynn to kick us off. Thanks so much.
Great. Thanks, Eve. And thanks everyone for coming out and joining us on this beautiful day. As you may know, I was supposed to lead a paddling field trip at Otter Creek Swamps this coming Saturday. Maybe some of you had signed up and were going to join me. And unfortunately, we had to cancel. So I'm hoping that I can share one of my favorite places to paddle with you here. So to set the stage, I'm going to share this video so you can see and hear what it's like to paddle through Otter Creek Swamps in the spring when it's flooded. The audio on this video is a little quiet, so listen closely just to get an idea of what it would be like if we were out there today. So during the spring flood, it's my favorite time of year to paddle at Otter Creek because it's really peaceful. You can paddle through the trees and you get a whole different perspective that you can't get for this area most of the year. If you were thinking of going out to paddle there, my favorite place to put in is on Swamp Road in Cornwall, near where the bridge is, because here generally the flow is slow enough and calm enough that you can paddle either upstream or downstream pretty easily. And in the spring, it usually floods in the first week of May, and the swamp here is open enough that you can really get in and paddle in between all the trees. One thing to remember if you are going out to paddle this time of year is that the water is very cold, so you want to make sure you're safe. And even though the water may appear to be flat and calm, there can still be a current going through, and because trees and other objects are submerged, they can be a hazard and snag your boat. So you want to be careful, as always, when out on the water. And so one other reason why this place is really special to me is because back in 2006 and 2007, when I started with the Nature Conservancy as an AmeriCorps member, we were starting a big restoration project of some land here where we planted almost 3,000 trees in some old agricultural fields. And at that time, my little sister, who was 14, she came out and she planted some trees with us as a volunteer. And you can see some people planting trees in that upper photo. Unfortunately, those aren't pictures of my sister because apparently I didn't take any of her that day. Sorry, Anna, if you're watching this. But then just last year, she came out in the spring to paddle with me. That's a picture of her in the bottom there. And we were able to paddle through all the trees that we had planted. So all the trees behind her there, some of the ones that we had planted. And I sort of feel like the growth of the trees and the restoration of this site to a more natural state has really progressed along with my career at TNC. And so I really enjoy seeing how my work is tangible and lasting, and it has a really meaningful impact on Vermont and the landscape around us. So we've been talking about Otter Creek a lot, and for those of you who don't know, Otter Creek is in the southern Lake Champlain Valley in Vermont. It's the longest river in the Champlain Basin, and it starts up in its headwaters in the Green Mountain National Forest and flows for over 100 miles all the way down to Lake Champlain, where it enters the lake in Ferrisburg. And so it drains almost 1,000 square miles of the state. And it's one of my favorite places to paddle any time of year. You know, even when it's not flooded, it's generally slow moving and easy to paddle. And because so much of the land along the river is conserved, there's lots of wildlife and other things to see along the way. And so in addition to being a great place to paddle, the Otter Creek Swamp Complex is really important ecologically in Vermont. It's a mosaic of many different types of wetlands that covers almost 15,000 acres in the state. And, you know, from marshes to floodplain forests to swamps, there's all those natural communities that are there are considered state significant because they're just really great examples of them. And so over 20 years ago, several conservation organizations in the state recognized how important this area was, and we've been working in partnership since then to protect some of these special places. And if you look at that map on the right, you can see all those different colored parcels of land have been conserved by either the Nature Conservancy or Vermont Land Trust or Vermont Fish and Wildlife. And you know, right now there are thousands of acres that have been protected in this whole basin. And so in addition to being important for wildlife and for different natural communities, the Otter Creek Swamp Complex is also really important when there are floods in Vermont. If you look at that aerial photo on the left, you can see what appears to be a lake. And that's not a lake, that's Otter Creek Swamps, which at the time of this photo a few years ago, it actually was the second largest lake in Vermont at the time. It can hold so much water, it acts like a sponge, and then it slowly releases them, which protects a lot of the land downstream. And so the biggest example of this, I know that graph and map on the right is a little complicated, but the biggest example of this was during Tropical Storm Irene in 2011, when a tremendous amount of water fell on Vermont. And in Rutland, the flow of Otter Creek swamps was 19,000 cubic feet per second. And there was a lot of flood damage in Rutland. But then 30 miles downstream, the town of Middlebury had very little damage. And the flow of water there at the peak was only 7,000 cubic feet per second. And the reason for that is because the river was able to overflow its banks in between in the Otter Creek complex. And that vast flat wetland soaked up a lot of water while the trees and shrubs slowed the flow. So the basin was able to hold that water like a sponge and then slowly release it down Otter Creek with much less power, which they estimate saved Middlebury over $1 million in potential damage. So these wetlands are really important both for people and for wildlife in this area. So next, Jim's gonna talk a little more about the wildlife that live here.
Okay, I'm a herpetologist, so I kind of favor reptiles and amphibians, but there's lots of cool types of wildlife that use the swamps. I mean, there's bobcat in there, and there's otter. I remember doing a field trip for the Nature Conservancy years ago. I don't remember how many canoes I had behind me. Let's say I had half a dozen canoes coming down the river, and came around a corner, and there was a mother otter with 2 young. And I was really hoping that the last canoe would come around that corner before those otters disappeared. And they did. Everybody got a chance to see Mama Otter and the young running along the bank. But I mean, locally, people, hunters are in there, bird watchers are in there. There's an area just to the east of the spot that Lynn was talking about, where there's major flights, major migration of waterfowl that come through there in the spring. The water right now starting to get down a little bit lower, starting to drop a little bit more now, and we'll start to see shorebirds coming through, such as greater yellowlegs and lesser yellowlegs and those sorts of things. But we've even seen some real rarities in there. Glossy ibis come through sometimes, and there was a godwit that came through one time. So it's really pretty cool in terms of all the wildlife that it serves. What I'm showing you here, though, and one thing I want to talk about is connectivity. If you can look at that topo map, and I know fewer people these days even have seen a topo map. They're used to Google Earth or some nice photo, but topographic lines are a mystery to some younger people, some of my students. But if you look there, you can see that there's some upland that's forested that has a little road that happens to be Morgan Road in Salisbury that goes right along the base of it. And below that is part of the Otter Creek swamps. And so all the wildlife that uses these swamps, I shouldn't say all, but most, has to move in and out of it. The swamps have to breathe. And so when the water gets too high for the bobcats, they've got to get up there into the uplands nearby. And for my critters, like the amphibians, we actually have a little amphibian preserve, overwintering amphibian preserve there. They come off that hillside that Lynn was pointing out to you, and then they come across that little road, and they get down into the swamp. And we could see thousands of amphibians crossing from the upland hardwoods down into the swamp in the spring. And we have public nights there. And when I say we, in this case, Otter Creek Audubon and our local conservation commission here in Salisbury have these public nights where people are invited to come see this migration. Of course, you can always go there on your own if you love to get out on those rainy spring nights, as I do. Can we look at the next one, Lynn? Mm-hmm. Some of the creatures that we're looking at here, upper left, spotted salamander. That's kind of the sexy megafauna of the amphibians, and people really like to see that one. And I'm still getting lots of reports into the Vermont Reptile Amphibian Atlas of that species. And I don't want to diss that species at all, but it's not a particularly rare species. And the other ones that you see here, let's say move just down below it, the blue spotted, that's one that is a lowland species that is really typical of the lowland swamps like the Otter Creek swamps. But not just the swamps, it's the edges of the swamps where they can move upland to overwinter so that they can get down in the ground deep enough so they don't freeze without hitting the water table. And interestingly enough, the Otter Creek swamps have islands scattered around. They have high points scattered around within the swamps, which serve as these upland refugia. And it's really kind of fun to get out in those spots in the spring and see all the amphibians that have been spending the winter up there undercover. You'd have to turn rocks and logs and stuff, and then they move down into the swamp and then back up. Another one that's pretty unique to the Otter Creek swamps and the Champlain Basin and the lowlands in general is that orangey brown salamander in the upper right. And many of you people may have seen or are familiar with redback salamanders. When you're out kicking around in your garden or cutting firewood, and you turn over a log and you see this little dark red colored 3-inch long skinny salamander. And a lot of people confuse that salamander and this one. Now, one easy way to tell the two apart is if you can grab it. First of all, if you can grab it, it's probably this salamander, the 4-toed salamander, because it's a lot easier to catch and the other one's fast. And if you do grab it and you flip it over, you see that bright white underside in the lower right with scattered black dots. And it also has, and you can see it if you look carefully at that photo, at the base of its tail, you can see a little line. And that's where that tail is going to break off. That's the tear here spot for, you know, small mammals and birds that try to catch that amphibian. If they grab it by the tail, as most would, that tail will break off. Rest of the salamander makes its escape and regrows a tail so that it gets to live and the predator gets a treat. Yeah, it's a loss. It's lost some of its stored energy, but it's a good survival technique. Can we look at the next one, Lynn? One of the interesting stories, and this was just last year, and VPR was calling it one of their, I think, favorite stories of the year. So it got played again around New Year's, was the huge population of northern leopard frogs, and that's what we're seeing here, that came out of the swamp last year. And these swamps are providing the breeding habitat, and it's that same habitat that Lynn was showing you, the flooded woods and fields that this species breeds in. It spends the winter underneath the water in the creek, down at the bottom, and it's a major food source for the fish, et cetera, that are down there under the ice. And then it comes up in the spring and it goes out into those flooded fields and breeds and lays these egg masses that have 1,000 eggs in them. But ordinarily, a lot of those flooded fields would dry before those eggs can hatch and metamorphose and get out of there. But last year, because it was so wet and there was so much flooding and it lasted so long, literally hundreds of thousands of northern leopard frogs successfully bred. And they spread out of the swamps, not unlike a biblical plague, but much cuter. And within, let's say, a couple months, they had made it up to about 3 miles away from the swamps as they dispersed. And some of those would have found another deep body of water where they could successfully overwinter. But there were literally hundreds of thousands of northern leopard frogs. And of course, many of them were food for all of the ducks and the otters and the raccoons and the skunks, etc. So it's one way, ecologically speaking, that nutrients are spread from the Otter Creek wetlands outward to the surrounding habitats. Could we take a look at the next one, Lynn? Some of the other creatures coming in and out of the wetlands are a variety of snake species, but one of the more unusual that uses the Otter Creek wetlands is this northern water snake. And I think that's a particularly handsome and tastefully subdued young fellow right there, but I realize not everybody has that same sense of taste that you have to develop over time to fully appreciate these snakes. But they need nearby, once again, they need the uplands, rocky uplands where they're going to overwinter. And there are some places where these snakes overwinter that are about, let's say, maybe a half mile or so from the swamps. And they travel down through people's homes and yards, et cetera, to get to the swamps in the spring and to get out of the swamps in the fall. And boy, I got a call from a lady that loves wildlife, but she really was afraid to leave her porch because she had some northern water snakes coming through her yard. And I had to make a house call and move the water snakes out of her yard so that she could get out of her house and kind of overcome her fear of walking around her yard. Could we move ahead a little bit there, Lynn? Of course, there's all the turtles that are in there too. And that particularly cute fella on the left, probably a cute mama, is a big snapping turtle. And snapping turtles don't bask so much as most other turtles. They move into the shallow water and they try to warm up in the shallow water. But in the spring, you might well see them as you're paddling through the swamps, or you may see one of them hauled out because, of course, they've been underwater all winter, and they're trying to warm up and raise their body temperatures up into the 80s would be ideal for them. And on the right, we have the very widespread painted turtle, which you can also see as you get down into those swamps and explore those territories. Next one, Lynn. So if you're at all interested, I mean, the organization that I run is the Vermont Reptile Amphibian Atlas, which we call the Vermont Herp Atlas for short, vermontherpatlas.org. And if you check us out online, and if you're interested in reporting what you see and helping us fill in our distribution maps for reptiles and amphibians in Vermont and informing our conservation efforts, what you would see is the top screen there if you went to our website. And then if you click on the priorities and data gaps, which we're doing in the lower image, you're going to see most wanted and rarest species, the first one. And there's a variety of species, no matter when you see them. Let's say if you saw a spotted turtle or a wood turtle, we'd want to know about it anytime you saw it, because that would be a very cool sighting. But below that, we have data gaps, reports and photos most needed. And if you clicked on that, and Lynn's going to simulate that for us, then you see this table. And in the upper right, I've typed in American toad. And so this tells you that there are 5 towns left in Vermont where we do not have photo documentation of an American toad. Not a hard critter to find, one that you might be running into in your garden this spring. And we would just love if you're from Pownell, Sandgate, East Haven, Vershire, or Halifax, to get a photo for photo documentation of those species. Another way you can use this form, and let's look at the next one, Lynn, is you could type in, let's say, a town, your town. In this case, I typed in Fairfax, and this tells you what we need documented from Fairfax. So if you lived in Fairfax and you ran into a bullfrog, we've got a report, but we really could use a photo for documentation. Ringneck snake, beautiful little snake, got a report, still need photo documentation. And the same with spring salamander, which is really not a swamp species at all, but a upland brook salamander. But if you're interested in helping out, check out those tables and maybe you could take some pictures and help us out with our data gathering. Let's go on to the next one, then.
All right. Well, thanks, Jim, for sharing all that about some of the reptiles and amphibians that we might find in the swamp.
You're welcome.
So in addition to conserving land in Otter Creek swamps, to protect this really resilient ecosystem, the Nature Conservancy also believes that long-term conservation requires good stewardship of this land that we own. And so we've been working here to restore some wetlands that had previously been converted to agriculture that I mentioned before with my little sister, where we've planted nearly 3,000 saplings beginning in 2006. And at that time, these fields had just recently been retired from hay and corn production. And so we have been monitoring those. And if you look at those 2 different aerial photos side by side, the one on the left is in 2003, before we started planting out there. And the one on the right is 2016. And you can see all those little trees and shrubs that are growing up now. So this area is starting to become more of the floodplain forest and swamp that it previously was. And in addition to the tree planting here, we've also installed a few bat houses, because there used to be a colony of little brown bats that lived in a covered bridge that was on Swamp Road right here that unfortunately it burned in 2016. And so we installed the bat houses in an effort to provide some shelter for the bats that were living there. And we've been monitoring those as well. And so the bats have returned, which is really important in this area because many of our bats have been affected by the fungus called white nose syndrome and are not doing very well. And so, we'll continue to monitor and care for these lands, and hopefully we'll conserve additional lands in the area where possible. And maybe someday I'll be able to get out there and paddle with you. Be on the lookout. We'll probably do another paddle field trip here next spring. And so that's all we had planned to talk about. But if anybody has questions, you can send them to us in the chat.
Great. Thanks, Lynn and Jim. And we do have a bunch of questions coming in. So let's start fielding them and make this more of a conversation. And I see some people trying to raise their hand digitally. Just please make sure instead of raising that hand, if you could just submit your question into the Q&A box, that'll be the best way for us to field them. So first question goes to Jim. Jim, what types of species are important for people to report to you? Are you looking for everything like a garter snake, or do you only want people to report more rare or unusual species?
Okay, question. If you look at that website that we were showing you online, it will tell you for each town what we need to have reported. And so there's a list of the rarer species that no matter where you are or when you see it, we would love to hear about it. But there's also the searchable table so that you can search for your town and see what needs to be reported from your town. So we really do we have very good information on distribution for garter snakes and well, American toad, the example that I showed you, we've got great information on American toad, except for those 5 towns. And if you lived in one of those 5 towns, we'd still love to have a report and photo of an American toad. So it depends on where you live and what the species is. And you can check that out at the website.
Great. Thanks, Jim.
Yeah.
Are water snakes poisonous?
Well, first of all, let me correct your terminology.
Okay.
We should be saying venomous. If you ask me if water snakes are poisonous, then it makes me think, okay, this person is going to eat this snake, and is it going to poison this person or not? You could eat that snake. You could even eat a rattlesnake if you like, and it will not poison you. But venomous, the term we use for something that can inject venom, like rattlesnakes, is a whole different thing. And we do not have any venomous water snakes in Vermont. So the common water snake, although some people start thinking as Southerners do about, say, a cottonmouth or water moccasin, our common water snake is not venomous. But on the other hand, it is not your starter snake. It's not the most docile snake. And so were you to pick it up, you should expect it to try to defend itself. It's not going to envenomate you, but it might give you a harmless bite that may surprise you.
So this question's for you, Lynn. With all the tree plantings that the Nature Conservancy has implemented in the Otter Creek swamps, how does the flooding impact them? Are the trees going to be okay?
Yes, we only planted species that can handle the flooding. So it was a lot of silver maples and green ash and dogwoods. And they were actually planted from seeds that we collected and grew in our conservation nursery. So they're all from local seeds. So they should be able to handle the cold of Vermont as well. Because some of the land that we owned is lower, we focused on planting mostly close to the river where there's a bit of a levee. So that gave the trees a little bit of a head start so they weren't flooded quite so long every spring. But they've been doing really well, and they should be able to handle the flooding just like all of the other larger trees that grew up in the swamp naturally.
Okay, thanks, Lynn. So here's a question about that covered bridge that burned down. Do we know what impact it's had for wildlife in the area? And I feel that to both of you, if you have any context for that.
Well, you guys, the Nature Conservancy, did put out those bat boxes to provide some alternative habitat for the bats that were once using the covered bridge. So I am sure that there were some negative consequences to the bats as a result of that bridge burning down. Hopefully, it will eventually be replaced. It may take a number of years, maybe a decade before that gets replaced. Other than the bats, I don't think there would have been much wildlife impact.
Lynn?
Yeah, I agree. In the monitoring that we've done of the bat houses, where we go out in the evening in the summer and try not to be eaten alive by mosquitoes so we can count the bats that are coming out of the bat boxes, we found that it seems that the colony has pretty much rebounded. We estimate there are about 200 bats that roosted in the bridge before it burned, and we've counted almost that number coming out of the bat boxes in the summer. So I think the bats are doing okay.
Okay, thank you. So here's a question on what are the natural woodland grazers of Vermont that help maintain a balanced ecosystem for ag land that is rewilded? Anyone?
The natural
woodland grazers of Vermont that help maintain a balanced ecosystem for ag land that is rewilded.
Well, there certainly would be, I guess deer come to mind first off as the grazers. It can be good or bad. I mean, if you were to talk to a lot of foresters, deer can get so dense that they do so much grazing of the young trees that some of the trees don't really have a chance to colonize. So there's got to be a balance there in terms of density. But beyond that, you've got all those other grazers like the woodchucks and the even porcupine will walk down into those fields and graze on the grasses.
Great. Thanks, Jim.
Yeah.
Lynn, can you identify some of the wildlife sounds played in the video clip at the beginning of the presentation?
Yes. You could probably, I'm not sure how well everybody could hear it, but there were some spring peepers that were peeping. And then at the end, there was a pileated woodpecker that was calling. Hopefully you were able to hear that. It sort of almost sounds a little bit like a monkey calling in the trees.
Great. Jim, here's a fun question. What is your favorite Vermont amphibian mating ritual?
Well, I guess that gives me a lead in to talk a little bit about wood frogs, because wood frogs, not unlike some of the other frogs, when they're calling and mating, they're not very discriminating. And so if they happen to come across a spotted salamander, they'll grab onto the spotted salamander and try to wait for that spotted salamander to lay eggs. I've seen them hanging on to the tops of cattails. I've been able to wiggle my fingers in front of them and get them to grab onto my fingers and try to mate with my fingers. We recently sent around a video, or I did, of one that grabbed onto the face of a fish, and it was waiting for that fish, or it thought, to lay eggs so that it could fertilize those eggs. So amplexus is what that's called, and it's pretty humorous when you see, well, I've seen spring peepers hanging on to, say, like dead mice that were floating in the water. You know, not unlike humans, sometimes amphibians are not particularly discriminating when it comes to mating behavior.
Thanks, Jim. Appreciate that. So here's a question from Jane. What are the yellow spots on the salamander? Also, why do they call it a leopard frog? So 2 questions.
Well, the yellow spots on the salamander, in theory, in terms of ecological theory, that would suggest that that's a warning, that bright yellow color. And it's true that spotted salamanders can produce some toxins, mostly from the tail, the posterior part of the body. And if anybody's handled a lot of the mole salamanders, those that live underground, you'll get this sticky glue-like substance on your hands. And it's not at all harmful to you, but it's a combination of a glue and a toxin. So it is gluing a toxin into the mouth of whatever predator is trying to eat it. And so it's a warning. Those bright yellow spots are a warning to potential predators. Now, obviously, there's some predators that get past that and have learned to overcome those toxins. But it does its best to warn predators. In terms of the leopard frog, I don't know how somebody came up with that name. Clearly, they must have been aware that there were cats out in the world that were called leopards that had spots. And northern leopard frogs do have very, very clear spots that are outlined in a really light halo. So to somebody, it made them think of an African cat.
Right. Thanks, Jim.
You bet.
So, Lynn, I'm going to field this question to you. Folks are thanking us for our great conservation work and are curious if we're coordinating with NRCS or Ducks Unlimited on restoring wetland properties.
Yes, we have coordinated with NRCS on some of the lands in the Otter Creek swamps to restore some marginal agricultural land back to wetlands. I don't know that we've worked with, did you say Trout Unlimited or
Ducks Unlimited?
I don't think we've worked with Ducks Unlimited or Trout Unlimited in this area, but we have elsewhere in the state. And that's a really important partnership when we think about conserving these wetlands here.
Right, thanks. And another question for you, Lynn. How much longer do you expect the area to be flooded and paddable? And where are the canoe access points and how difficult steep are they?
Usually this area floods in the first week of May. But this winter we didn't have a lot of snow, and a lot of the floodwaters here are when the snowpack melts. So I don't know if it's still flooded right now. Jim, have you been down this way lately? I haven't been out this way.
My wife goes through there regularly, and she tells me that the floodwaters are receding, but you could still paddle the creek itself any time of year.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of actually getting way out into the woods and really getting a chance to explore, I think you could still do that in some places, but fewer places than you could have a couple weeks ago.
Mm-hmm. And the boat access on Swamp Road is right where Swamp Road in Cornwall crosses Otter Creek. At the bridge, there's a parking lot that Fish and Wildlife maintains for access, and it's not very steep down to the water. There's a little ramp, so you can go right down and put your boat in very easily there.
Great, thank you. Lynn, one more for you. What are the most important priorities for conservation in the Otter Creek wetland area? Are there new projects planned?
I think the most important priorities are, conserving some of the lands that abut land that's already conserved. So kind of building out so that we have bigger chunks of conserved land next to each other that provides a little more space for wildlife movement. It connects some of those conserved lands. And, there are some projects that are, I think, currently in the works, and we just purchased a few new parcels over the winter. Many of these parcels are scattered throughout the interior of the swamp, so they're a little harder to visit than this piece that we're talking about off of Swamp Road. But they're all really important just for connecting the different conserved lands in this area.
Great. Jim, are there any fun sightings that have popped up lately or in the past couple of years? A species in a new town where you didn't think it existed, or new sightings of a species like Fowler's toad or boreal chorus frog?
Well, this person knows what they're talking about. Sadly, boreal chorus frog has disappeared from Vermont. We have not found a boreal chorus frog since 1999. That was the last time that Mark Ferguson of Vermont Fish and Wildlife was able to hear two frogs, and that was the last we heard from them. And we don't really know, sadly, we don't really know why they disappeared. They were only, as far as we know, they were only in the northwestern portion of Vermont, Grand Island, Franklin County. But in terms of other sorts of surprises, recently I was pleasantly surprised to find that there were blue-spotted salamanders. That's one of the ones I showed you that uses the Otter Creek swamps, but we haven't found very many of them on the other side of the state in the Connecticut River swamps. And it may be because much of the Connecticut River is controlled by dams, and so it doesn't flood as much. But there's a portion way up near Canada, and this is actually as far north and east as you can get in Vermont. It's Canaan, where we're starting to get these records of blue-spotted salamanders. And in my trips up there, I see that they actually do have, and it sounds counterintuitive, but as you get closer to Canada, it's a wider floodplain. It's more like the Champlain Valley than the middle portion of the Connecticut River, the southern portion. It's a wider, flatter floodplain with oxbows, and there's blue-spotted salamanders coming in and out of the floods along the upper Connecticut River, which was a surprise to us. People have just recently this spring filled in some records for some fairly common species. Just before this show, I got the first report of a DeKay's brown snake from Shaftesbury, which was really cool. And it's not, a particularly rare snake, but we had never had a report from Shaftesbury until today.
Thanks, Jim.
Yep.
Lynn, do you have some favorite put-in places on the creek?
My favorite place to put in is on Swamp Road, in part because that's where we've done our big restoration project. So I always like to check it out while I'm down that area. But another place that I love to paddle during the spring flood, other than Otter Creek swamps, is at the mouth of the La Platte River in Shelburne. There's a big floodplain forest there that the Nature Conservancy has also protected. That's really just beautiful, and it floods similarly to Otter Creek, where you can get in and paddle in between all the trees there too. So if you live more in the northern part of the state, I would recommend checking out the mouth of the La Platte as a place to paddle.
Great, thanks, Lynn. And Jim, this question's for you from Bill. In the year of the bountiful leopard frogs, was any damage noticed in the swamps from trees being submerged for longer than normal?
I have not noticed that. If we think of first of all, like Lynn was talking about, these species of trees that are down in there are only the species that can withstand flooding. Things like black ash and green ash and silver maple that can handle flooding, and they can handle being underwater for a period of time. So I haven't noticed any damage to trees. Obviously, we're concerned for the future. Black ash is one of the ashes that's most sensitive to this beetle that's coming in from various parts of the Midwest and is in Vermont now. What's the name of the beetle?
Emerald ash borer.
The emerald ash borer, and black ash is one of the most sensitive species to that particular insect. So we have concerns about what the swamp might look like in the future, but I don't have a lot of concerns about the level of flooding. Another thing we should keep in mind is that these wetlands were flooded for longer periods of time historically, because many of these areas have been ditched for decades so that they would drain quicker. And organizations like the NRCS are working to fill up and plug up some of those drains so that the floodlands actually hold water longer, so that they can support amphibians, breeding fish, migrating waterfowl, etc. I will say, though, that farmers sure had a hard time with that increased water level last year. Many of them couldn't get on to their wettest fields because they were just too wet, too long.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
And to build on that, there's a question, Lynn, from Susan. How deep does the water get during flooding? And what has been the deepest you've personally seen, Lynn?
I'd say the deepest I saw was last spring when I went out there, and that's when many of these photos were taken. And it was deep. I don't know how deep it was because in many places you couldn't see the ground. So I'm guessing it was, I don't know, 6 feet or more. And it can flood considerably. If you see in that bottom right hand photo that's there, you know, we were paddling as the flood was already subsiding, and that line that you see throughout the photo is the line where the flood level had been before we were there. And so, you know, we were able to easily paddle our boats through. We weren't hitting bottom. And so I think at its peak, it could easily be, you know, more than 6 feet of floodwaters in this area.
Okay. So a question probably for both of you to comment on. How are bats doing in Vermont generally?
They're under some real pressure because of white nose syndrome. And so species that were once common have now been listed, like the little brown bat. So there's some real threats to bats, though it does appear that there's some leveling off in terms of mortality of bats, and that perhaps that the level of mortality, well, as we talk about with the coronavirus, we're flattening the curve.
Lynn, do you have anything to add?
I would just add that, you know, as Jim said, it does appear that the rate of death from the disease is reducing, and we've been working with Vermont Fish and Wildlife to study the bats at our Mount Aeolus natural area down in Dorset, which is the biggest bat cave in the Northeast. And they've been working for years to study the bats there, and they feel like it's looking promising. Unfortunately, bats reproduce very slowly and generally only have 1 pup a year or so. So it'll take a long time for the bat population to really recover.
I should add, I think that there's some other species of bats like the big brown bat, which is a lot less susceptible to the disease. I have bat houses here at my house in Salisbury, and I have a regular crew of 20 to 30 big browns that are using my bat houses, and they seem to be quite resistant to that particular disease.
Okay. Thank you. So a question for you, Lynn. Laura has farmland with wetland that she is trying to restore. What are the best plants and shrubs for her to reintroduce?
Yeah, I think depending on how long it's wet, but in general, species like red maples or silver maples, willows, dogwoods. I don't know if you really want to plant green ash or black ash right now, since we do now have emerald ash borer in the state, and it's likely they'll die. But you can also work with the Intervale Conservation Nursery, and they can help you choose some species that might be best suited for your land there. And all of their seeds are collected locally, so they should survive in our winters.
Thanks, Lynn. And Jim, are sightings entered into iNaturalist picked up in the Vermont Herp Atlas?
I do. I download the new reptile amphibian records once a year when the season's over, and I look through them, the iNaturalist records, to cherry pick those that are unusual or that would fill in distribution gaps. So I do check those. It's easier for me if you know that you have an unusual record or you could be filling in a distribution gap. It's easier for me if they're sent directly to me, but I do check those records once a year, and I go and try to get hold of those pictures and download the data that we need.
Great. Do you have plans for building bat houses? Anyone?
I know that there are some online that you can find, and that's where we found them for the ones that we built. But I could, if you want more details, you could email me after and I could point you in the right direction.
And that's a good time for me to mention also that there will be a follow-up email after this event with links to these resources. So you don't have to write things down. We'll get that email out to you.
You might also want to check Bat Conservation International online and their webpage. I'm sure they have links to designs for bat houses.
And I think this is a question for all of us to reflect on, and probably both of you to field. Is there anything we as citizens can do to advocate for wetland protection?
That's a big question. And I would say there's a lot of things we can do. I think one of the most important things is as much as possible being familiar with the wetlands around you and really, caring and learning why they're so important. And then talking to people, talk to your select board or your local legislators about how important those are. That's one way you can help to spur conservation.
You can also work to bring in some of the expert wetlands ecologists. Everybody in the state has a wetlands ecologist that covers whatever part of the state you live in. And these people are working for the state, and they love to get out there and give presentations. If you want to organize a presentation in your town, or maybe the library wants to organize it, or if you have a conservation commission in town, they can bring in these people and they can lead field trips and give presentations for you. Or you can also report to them concerns that you have about maybe people draining a wetland where they shouldn't. Or I was talking to a woman just this morning who had concerns about some vernal pools being drained in Dummerston. And so I put her in touch with, in that particular part of the state, it's Rebecca Chalmers, who's their wetland ecologist. So there's lots of people who would love to come and give a presentation or lead a field trip, or maybe you can lead the field trip yourself.
Thanks. And we have a comment from Cassandra answering that question about bat house plans. And she suggests looking up the Vermont Bat Center in Milton because they have plans to send out. So share that with everybody. I think we really only have time for one. We've had so many questions. What a great conversation. So why don't we end on this note, as Jim started his presentation talking about all the species that depend on these wetlands, let's end on the final question about whether or not the Otter Creek is important for migratory birds.
Oh, for sure. There are, in this same area that Lynn's talking about where she likes to paddle, there are flooded fields that are heavily used, big birdwatcher attractive areas, and large flocks of waterfowl come through and stage there during migration. And that not only there, but from Brandon all the way down to the mouth of Otter Creek where it hits Lake Champlain. Tremendously important for migrating waterfowl, shorebirds, as well. In terms of breeding, that's fewer species. There's a lot more species that move through. The ones that actually stay here and breed, like wood ducks and black ducks and mallards and hooded mergansers, are all taking advantage of those swamplands. I can't say year round, but 3 seasons anyhow.
Right. Lynn?
Oh, I mean, I think Jim definitely covered that. Or were you going to ask me another question?
No, we're going to wrap up.
All right.
Nothing to add?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you all. What a great conversation. Thank you to our presenters, Lynn and Jim, for taking the time. Obviously, folks had a lot of questions about wetlands and the species there in this particular natural area. We thank you all for joining us. We will be having another webinar on how we're bringing back the American elm actually to our floodplains in 2 weeks. So look for an email about that or follow us on social media. And thank you all. Have a great afternoon and enjoy the sun before the cold sets in for the weekend.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.